Started.
For those of you just joining, we'll get started in a few minutes. Wait another minute or two before we get started. Just letting a couple more people join. We'll wait one more minute and then get started. Okay, let's get started. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for part 2 of our series on planning for success in clinical trials. In today's webinar, we're going to discuss case studies for situations where things didn't go exactly as planned and how we dealt with those situations. I'm Lisa Jenkins VanLuvanee. I'm a 25-year veteran in the pharma industry. I started my career as a statistician, and then I moved into regulatory affairs after 7 years. I've worked in large pharma, in small companies, and as a consultant, and I'm currently the Chief Operating Officer and Head of Research and Development at Facet Life Sciences. Facet is a U.S. regulatory affairs and development consulting company that works with small organizations to help them get their products to and through FDA and into patients. I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, but I'm also going to present a case study from my own experience. Just like in our last webinar, we'll be asking you to take polls to provide your input and your perspectives on our topics. We'll be dedicating the final 15 minutes for questions and answers. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit your questions throughout the webinar. We'll do our best to address as many as possible during that period, but for any questions we don't get to, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us on the panel. We're happy to continue the conversation with you. In addition, everyone who's registered is going to receive a link to a recording of the webinar after it's over. So let's dive right into our topic and introduce our esteemed panelists. Jason.
Hi, I'm Jason Mercer. I'm a strategic program champion with Facet Life Sciences. I have over 15 years of experience helping small, medium, and large companies to navigate the complexities of FDA regulation through product development. And I have a particular focus on regulatory and clinical strategy.
Thank you, Jason. Deb, please.
Hi, everyone. I'm Deb Anderson. I work in strategic partnerships at Veramed, which is a global biometric CRO focused on data management, stats, and stat programming services. My role is to work with sponsor organizations to develop biometric solutions that meet their needs and their budgets. I have about 25 years of experience in the field of drug development, and I've worked in pharma, medical device, and CRO companies within stat programming standards and data management teams. I look forward to sharing my experience with you today.
Thank you, Deb. And Mark.
Thank you, Lisa. Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Holland, also from Veramed, where I'm the head of program delivery, where my role includes supporting development of the Veramed stat computing environment, supporting teams across all deliveries using the SaaS platform and helping with their CDIS knowledge and deployment as well as being a member of the CDIS global support team. I've also been in the pharma industry for over 25 years, spending the first half of my career in big pharma, learning the ropes as a SaaS programmer and working with CDISC in its infancy. Then moved across into CRO, leading programming departments, continuing to extend my own skill set in maintaining SaaS platforms, working with clients on CDISC deliverables, be that large pharmas and small biotechs.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, let's turn to our agenda. First, I will spend a little bit of time reviewing part one of our webinar and our takeaways from that. Then we'll move into our case studies. And after that, we're going to pivot to talk about when to stick with your current partner and when to make the hard decision to move to a different partner in situations where you've got some challenges. And then we'll turn toward Q&A. So first, key takeaways from part one. This is essentially our guidance to you in trying to plan for success for your clinical trial. And the first key takeaway is making sure that you make it a priority to select the right regulatory and biometrics partners at the start. These are not intended to be decisions to take lightly. They shouldn't be add-ons or afterthoughts. You'll get the best support if you plan proactively. Second, for your clinical trial, you want to identify the purpose of that trial first. Is it a study that you're going to use for a regulatory purpose? Is it an exploratory study? Is it a research study to understand important research questions about your product? The reason why you are conducting the trial should drive what happens after. So success in the conduct and execution of that trial really relies on setting that purpose and then bringing the team members together to provide a multidisciplinary view and recommendations on how to conduct the trial. Regulatory, medical, clinical operations, statistics, programming, all those constituencies have important roles in ensuring that the trial runs smoothly. So they want to be brought in both on the purpose as well as then contribute to how they'll fulfill that purpose during the conduct of the study. Ensure that you build regulatory and biometrics quality from the start. So just as you want to have a protocol that is detailed and team vetted, you also want to have a statistical analysis plan drafted and a study data standardization plan as early as possible. This will ensure that you don't run into surprises in the middle of the trial. You also want to make sure that if you're planning on using your trial, or you might even possibly use that trial for regulatory purposes, that you discuss your plan with health authorities and with IRBs and IECs. It's funny how FDA and IRBs and IECs like to put their spin on these things and contribute to your protocol. So if you need to vet that with those constituencies, make sure that you do so in advance. You also want to understand, as the sponsor, the full traceability of the data from the case report form all the way through to a regulatory submission, if that's your purpose, and everything in between. If you don't know or understand what all those steps are, it's the sponsor's responsibility to know and understand. So learn each piece, talk to the experts so that you understand the data flow. Be sure to anticipate any roadblocks and plan for delays, because delays always happen. And bear in mind that things always take longer and they always cost more than anticipated. But good planning can generally serve to reduce delays and keep costs in check. So that's how to plan for success. But in my experience, I've never seen a situation where everything goes perfectly as planned. And I'm sure our audience hasn't either. So let's get some feedback from our audience on where they've seen things go awry. If we could turn to our first poll, please. Hey, do we have our results? Wow, it looks like our audience has seen lots of different scenarios where there are challenges. That's great. So let's turn now to our panel to start with our first case study. Jason.
Great. So our first case study deals with an early development, early clinical trial situation. The scenario is that we were working with a small company to file their first IND for a new chemical entity, and the company received what was an unexpected clinical hold due to an anomalous toxicology finding in male rats. This particular issue had been identified by the non-clinical study director as something that was procedure related. In other words, it had determined that it wasn't related to test article, so it wasn't identified as a risk in filing the IND. I believe if we can move to the next. So the problem that this created for the company was that the company already had clinic time booked with the phase 1 clinic. They were already dedicated resources to beginning the clinical study, and the FDA was requiring a male fertility study in the rats in order to have the clinical hold lifted. This is going to result in at least a 6 to 9 month delay of the clinical study start, which is really a hard blow for a small company that's getting ready to become, a clinical stage company versus a preclinical stage company. So I'd like to take a moment just to ask the audience what you think might have happened or how we might have solved the situation. Do we have results? It looks like we've got some people that are going to have the right answer here, and we'll. I guess we can move on here. So the folks that chose moving into females only, that's actually what we ended up doing. So by looking at the FDA's feedback in the clinical hold letter, what we realized was that the real problem was a fear that there was an undue risk to male participants in the study. We already knew the timeline because we had been talking to the toxicology vendor about possibly getting in with this study and doing the male fertility study. So we knew that it was going to be about a 6 to 9 month delay. And so we went back to the FDA with a clinical protocol amendment to exclude males from the study in the beginning, and communicated with the FDA that our intention was to conduct the male study and to come back with an amendment later once the male fertility study in the rats was completed, in order to, and assuming that it would come back clean. And the FDA was okay with this. And ultimately, given study startup time and the amount of time taken once the clinical hold was switched to a partial clinical hold, the delay was really only a few months between female subjects coming in and male subjects coming in. And most importantly for the company, they were able to begin a clinical study and become that clinical stage or company, which is important for a really small company. So I think, Mark, you're going to present case study 2, and I believe we were going to start with the poll. So maybe we could switch over.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you, Jason. Yeah, so we can start with the poll. I'll just quickly read out the question because a lot of information on screen. So in a study where there's been a number of significant challenges in the management and processing of the data standards and results, how best is it to handle these in the submission documentations that's shared to the agencies? So just give everyone a minute or so to select their chosen response. Okay, just a couple more seconds. And if we could have the results, please. Okay, yep, that's good. That's where I was hoping we get the majority. Yes, be transparent, but with the extra detail we can't see on screen is providing that open summary and why decisions were made by the sponsor. So thank you very much. So if I could go on to case study number 2, please. Thank you, Lisa. Okay, so the particular scenario I'd like to talk through is actually a number of scenarios across a program of studies where within the biometric space, there are multiple vendors all taking part in various different parts of the process. These differed not just within studies, but also across phases of the package. This in itself led to a number of challenges with the information being managed and processed across the whole program of studies. And that was both in real time while studies were taking place, but also sort of downstream when we're starting to prepare for the submission as well. So a number of specific problems that were seen in this situation. The first arose on something that is quite simple, but actually quite detailed as well, sort of from a data perspective. This was within some early phase studies. The stat programming team saw the data and the CRF quite late in the day, and it was clear that the protocol hadn't been fully reviewed by the necessary biometric stakeholders. Now, some of the data points that were quoted in the protocol and therefore the CRF weren't actually CDIS compatible. This was focused specifically on the collection of adverse event information. So something that's quite basic on the surface as the question that is action taken against study drug. The option on the protocol was dose change, which on the surface that seems okay. But CDIS requires directionality in the result as to whether it was dose increased or dose decreased. And for this particular CDIS data point, there aren't alternatives allowed within what's called the control terminology for CDIS. With no other tangible information in the clinical database to allow that directionality to be given, it couldn't be directly mapped. And so from the offset on that study, there was going to be a level of incompatibility and an immediate concession would be needed downstream. Now, luckily, this was captured on the first study, so it didn't become a widespread problem across the whole package. It really shows the importance of all the key stakeholders in biometrics being part of the process right from the offset to make sure that data is collected with submission mindset moving forward. Second particular example within the package was where the ownership of data in the process by a specialist vendor wasn't taken on by the necessary team right from the start. That meant that the data flow became excessively complex for the life cycle of that particular study. So the data management team had left the management of this particular piece of raw data to the biostat reporting team, and for them to work with their ePro vendor, as it was deemed to be information that only the reporting team would actually understand. Furthermore, when this data was reviewed after the start of the study, it left no room for improving the data structure and refinement to make it more aligned with the study requirements and what was required for the analysis of the data. This also meant there were some of the standard data management cleaning tasks that would normally take place. They weren't consistently managed across the study. So classic third-party data reconciliation wasn't fully completed. Mapping of simple data points compared to the main clinical database likewise weren't completed. And this provided, or this drove an excessive amount of additional programming and workarounds with the SDTM and the add-on processing. A number of concessions unfortunately had to be accepted, but they could have been easily avoided again if everybody had been owning the necessary parts of the process and that review up front before any data collection had started. Third item then now focuses right to the other end of the spectrum and looking at the submission packages, specifically the data reviewer's guide and the defined XML. These have been developed by different vendors, both within studies and across a program. And these led to different styles on how this information is written. Clearly, it's going to be different styles for different individuals, but across the whole package with that big variety of roles, big variety of vendors, we were getting a lot of variability within those documentation. And furthermore, we didn't have an SDSP, or there was no SDSP in place for the study data submission plan. And so that document wasn't able to be used as that single point of reference, which would have helped with that consistency. And finally, once we got onto once the team got onto the integration itself, there were further challenges in pooling that data because of the upstream inconsistencies that I mentioned and the different vendors involved with the package at the time. So that was different variables or similar variables, I should say, collected under different names, makes pooling of that data more complicated. And again, that's based on that variable history of the SDTM packages. Again, further additional programming, further time, further documentation required to get the information as we would have expected for the submission, and also cross-checking back to the CSR. So solutions in real time can very much take place to explain the background of the data that we've seen, and as per the original question I mentioned, being transparent in the challenges that one is facing is really important so that you're well documenting all those assumptions that one has had to make. Concessions that you have to make upstream will snowball, unfortunately, as time goes by. So a retrospective fix downstream, yes, it can happen, but it will take more time and it will take more resource. The best strategy is always going to be planning all of these aspects upfront, strong, detailed plans from the start, maybe even planning particular milestones at a point in time early on in the team, and maybe even conducting some sort of gap analysis to see how the first couple of studies have gone, so that if you need to, refocus one's direction, then we can do so. Don't be afraid to question how things have happened early in the process, because in the long run, any adjustment early on could be significantly beneficial later in the process. Okay, thank you very much. That's my case study. Lisa, Debs, over to you.
So Mark, I would imagine this situation is pretty common because, product development takes a significant amount of time. You might use different CROs, different, as standards evolve, different standards are applied to different studies. So I'm betting that this happens actually more often than not. So this case study is a great example of how to plan up front to ensure success as you develop your product through the different phases of clinical trials. So it's a great case study. Thank you. Okay, on to our next case study. Deb, if you will.
Great, thank you, Lisa. And that makes perfect sense. This case study actually fits really nicely into some of your comments there, because it really could have been avoided by planning standards up front and having a clear study data standardization plan. So in this situation, we had a small company that was working on a submission for several completed and ongoing studies, and they had worked with a variety of vendors on those studies. So the sponsor had accepted deliverables from those different vendors, and many were in a CDISC-like format, others were not. They were all kind of somewhere on the spectrum of standardized. During the submission preparation phase, the sponsor was looking at the submission packages and the Pinnacle 21 reports to validate how ready they were for submission. And the reports were showing significant issues, including some items categorized as errors, which caused concern for the sponsor. So to address the situation, initially they went back to their vendors to work with them on a plan to remediate the issues. And the vendors came back with plans. The plans were generally to fully address all of the issues through remapping and kind of some issue resolution activities. But those came with a hefty change order and a significant time delay. Now, I think we can all agree, though, that's a viable option to approach this problem that way, and it's maybe the safest option. But in this situation, the time and cost were really key considerations for the sponsor. So they were looking for an alternative to manage the situation and engaged Veramed to provide a solution. So what we did is we worked with the team to evaluate the data packages that they had in their submission to determine where changes were absolutely critical. And where we had to update the mapping, we made those changes and regenerated the associated key analyses. But for the items that we recommended not to update, we instead provided rationale for those studies or those data items that we didn't update, and then why we chose not to update them and why they were okay to submit as is. So we provided thorough documentation around our rationale. We worked with the sponsor to talk to the FDA about the plan, and the FDA ultimately accepted our plan and the submission, so it worked out well. The sponsor was quite happy with the outcome.
Deb, I love this case study because on one hand, you could have done everything, but it would have been very expensive and very costly, and I'm sure FDA would have been happy to have received, right, the perfect package. But I love this win-win solution where you made judgment calls based on rational decisions and logic of what must be changed versus, nice to haves, and came in with a solution that was satisfactory to both the FDA and the sponsor's budget and timeline. What a great example, and something that we should all strive for when we find challenges like this during clinical trials. That's fantastic. All right, we'll turn to our next case study.
Great, this one's mine as well, Lisa.
Yes.
So we've covered some cases that can occur in clinical trials where companies have prospectively designed data collection mechanisms and their plans for analysis, and talked about how issues can arise even when you have detailed plans in place. But we're seeing an increase in requests to utilize real-world data or non-traditional sort of data sources, which data is not collected then through a prospectively designed EDC system or within a controlled clinical trial. And but the data still has scientific value and can be used to provide additional evidence of a drug's effectiveness, safety, or real-world clinical outcomes. So in this particular case, there was a strategic plan put in place to use data from a cooperative oncology group to support a pediatric label extension or expansion. So we were provided data that was not really planned for this purpose. We received the data and we essentially just kind of had to deal with what we received, right? So the problem was that there were a lot of issues, particularly missing data, some uncollected data, so data that would be expected in a CDISC compliant data set that was not collected. The data wasn't coded, and we were unable to query to code some of the data. So we had to put a plan in place to be able to effectively analyze the data and utilize it to meet the goals of the plan, but also deal with the data issues we were seeing. So what did we do? We proactively communicated to the regulatory agency regarding the limitations of the data. So we said, you normally require X, Y, and Z. We don't have those pieces of data. What we can provide you are A, B, and C, and here's our plan to do so. We documented everything that was a discrepancy from an expected standard with a very detailed rationale for why the expected data was not provided, but why we thought that the data was still valuable and useful as is. And so again, this really gets around kind of two key messages: communication with the regulatory agency on your plan and your rationale, and documentation in order to clearly communicate that rationale and the details around the mitigations that you've put in place. So in the end, the submission was accepted. And again, the client was very happy with the outcome.
Great. So look, real world evidence is kind of having its heyday, right? And regulators are excited to receive this information because it provides a richness beyond what a clinical trial could provide. But you're right, it doesn't always come in the best format and a format that you would expect for a controlled trial. So I loved how you handled it. And it's something that I think sponsors need to think hard about. Real world data provides important information, but if you're going to be using it in a regulatory submission, you need to think proactively and have a plan for how you're going to deal with it. So thank you. So we'll turn to our last case study. It's mine, and it's an example of a situation where the client needed to make some decisions about its partners. So we were working with a small company who conducted all of their clinical trials outside the United States with ex-US CROs. They didn't have any internal regulatory or biometrics teams, and they didn't have the information that they needed in order to go forward. They came to Facet and asked Facet to conduct a gap analysis because they wanted to submit an NDA in the US. So when we did the gap analysis, we found out that the sponsor didn't have any FDA compliant data packages for any of their clinical trials, particularly for their pivotal studies, and that's required. We talked to the sponsor about going back to the CROs to see if the CROs would be willing to put the data in compliant format. One CRO was no longer in business. One CRO, which posed some challenges. One CRO didn't have the capability to put the data into the right format. They were willing to do it, but the timeline that would be associated with that and potential regulatory risk of them never having done it before led the sponsor to say, I'm not sure this is our best path forward. We also noted that they had no interaction with the FDA. And having done all their trials ex-US, we thought it very important for them to talk to the agency about the package that they were submitting and would it be acceptable to FDA for this submission. So I believe I have a poll to ask our folks to tell us what you would do in a situation like this. Okay, do we have our votes? Yeah, panic. That was what our sponsor initially wanted to do. But the reality is that we did a variety of the other options. So let me talk through those. So the very first thing we did was create a comprehensive regulatory and biometrics NDA plan. What did we need in order to go forward to submit to the FDA? And as part of that plan, we wanted to hold a meeting to discuss our plans with the FDA, vet them, and make sure that the FDA was comfortable with what we were doing. As part of that meeting, we got some good guidance that suggested that, just like in Deb's case study, some of the things FDA wanted us to do, and other things they accepted us to make some compromises. So that was great. Unfortunately, we realized fairly quickly that we weren't going to be able to reasonably use the CROs to create those data packages. And so we worked with this sponsor to identify biometrics partners who could do the work in the time and budget that the client had set for this activity, and help them select the right partners to create the dataset packages and associated documentation. So with that, I want to pivot a little bit to talk about making these decisions as sponsor for when you stick with your current provider or when you move to another provider. So let's start with a poll and ask our audience what they think about decision making here. Okay, do we have our results? Lots of differing opinions on what needs to be done, and there's really no right answer. So let's turn to our panel to talk about that. Deb, would you walk us through this slide, please?
Sure. Thanks, Lisa. Yeah, hopefully too many people that are participants haven't dealt with too many of those red flags that were listed in the poll, but yeah, so there's no like checklist that you go through to determine when you might need to pursue a different vendor, right? Everything is specific to the situation. So the aim here is really just to make sure that you're thinking about these considerations when you're facing that decision, right? So number one is time. So is changing a vendor going to save or cost you time in the long term? So think about, if you bring in a new vendor, what things do you need to do to get them up to speed? There's time associated with that. But then also think, if you stick with your current vendor and they, if they've missed timelines, if there's been delays, if there's rework required, what's the time that you'll need to invest in order to manage through that situation? So it's the time for the known of bringing in a new vendor, but also the time for the unknowns and risk associated with it. Having an established relationship with a trusted sort of rescue vendor. So there's some vendors that do a really great job. They thrive on these sorts of situations, coming in, assessing the problem, figuring out a plan, figuring out how to quickly resolve issues. So knowing who those vendors are and having a relationship with a trusted rescue vendor definitely saves time, so you can get them involved quickly if needed. Cost is another factor. It's always a factor. Is staying with the current vendor going to cost more in the long run? Will there be rework? Will there be changes required? Be sure to consider secondary costs or kind of opportunity costs. So if there's if related to time, if there's a delay in the activities that you work on, if there's a delay in the submission, what's the cost impacts of that? Risk is a key consideration. So assess the severity of the risks to your objectives. So are there quality issues? Are SOPs not being followed? What what are the risks and how severe are they? Ensure that you've done your due diligence to share those risks that you've identified with your vendor and ask them for solutions first. So if possible, they should be mitigating those risks. But if they're unable to do so, or you find their mitigation strategies insufficient, then it may be time to look for a different vendor. And then priority. So is your vendor making you a priority? Do you feel that they're partnering on you with your goals? Are they engaged to make sure that the objectives and that the goals that you've set forward are a priority for them as much as they're a priority for you? So those. When working with a vendor, we talked about this in webinar 1, when selecting a vendor to start out with, it's important that you feel that you're a priority and that vendor is going to make your project and your work a priority for them. So Jason, I think you had mentioned previously that you had a case that illustrated this. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So, and I think all of the points that you've brought up are really, really important to, when you're considering whether or not to switch, because by the time that you reach, the point of being ready to file an NDA, if you've been working with a vendor, then you've got, sunk costs already. They've already got everything. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of there's time and cost considerations in bringing on a new vendor because they're going to have to get up to speed. So we've recently had a client that sort of got in what you might consider a nightmare scenario of discovering discrepancies in their data entry, and even having some issues with the vendor sending blinded information to the wrong people who shouldn't have received it, and things like that. But ultimately looking at these different factors with that vendor and deciding that they felt it was too big of a risk to move on. I will say, for the sake of transparency, that we did recommend that from our perspective and what we were seeing, that the red flags were probably we recommended them to move on. And it's an illustration of sort of making that decision, and it has resulted in time and money losses in that case, because they didn't really sit down and assess the whole picture. They just looked at the what they'd already put into that vendor, if you will, in terms of already getting those resources aligned and having that vendor with all of their package. And they looked at what it might take to bring on another vendor, and they made the decision to stay, because they kind of felt like they were stuck at that point. And it could have turned out differently, but I think that one of the things, what I would say they probably missed was, really considering of what is the capability of that vendor to sort of rescue their own issues at that point, once you start really seeing that things have gone wrong, and getting things back on track. Some vendors, as you mentioned, are good at doing that. People do make mistakes, and those mistakes are not always indicative of what the normal work procedure is for that vendor. So all of these things sort of figure into the calculus of what you do in the end.
Great, thank you both. All righty, let's turn to our summary and key takeaways across our 2 webinars. So Again, select regulatory and biometrics partners, and for that matter, all partners, with care and intention. Make sure you know them, and understand what you're getting at the start. You want to be aligned. You want to build in quality up front. That's your best chance of saving time and money and setting things off on the right foot. But be ready. Be nimble and ready to handle when things don't go as planned. It's not always catastrophic. In fact, it's rarely catastrophic. I've never seen something that we can't save within the biopharma industry. There's always some way to move forward. Know your drivers for sticking with a partner versus moving on to an alternative. Sometimes it makes sense, to stick with the partner, and it's, faster, cheaper, less risk. Sometimes it makes sense to move to an alternative. Every situation is different. But as Deb pointed out, and I agree with her, there are organizations that are set up to handle these kinds of challenges. They are used to taking on rescue situations and righting the ship for success. So as you talk to your providers as a small organization, talk to them specifically about their ability to handle these kinds of challenges, because challenges always happen. Okay, we'll turn to Q&A. There are quite a lot of questions we have received. I will start with the first one, a great one. A common trend I have observed from the case studies is that each team suffers from a lack of planning and receiving poor quality inputs, missing data in the wrong format. Why does this happen so much? Is it because the teams are not resourced and do poor quality work as a result? Or is it poor governance? Or is it an unclear statement of work? I'd love to hear your thoughts. I will open that up to the entire panel.
I'll grab the first shot at that one. I would say it's maybe sometimes all of the above. These things happen for a variety of reasons. If I were to try to say on average what I see most often, it's usually not incompetence so much as programs develop in more organic fashion, especially when we work with smaller companies that spin out of academia. Sometimes these early studies are really almost academic studies. And, the initial thought may not have been that this is eventually going to support a drug approval, or it may have been designed by academic scientists who've never designed a study and with those requirements of what the regulatory requirements are in mind. And so you really have just kind of the way the program evolved, and you end up with a mishmash. Or, there are situations where the company or the asset itself has changed hands and you have different people managing it. There's just a variety of different reasons.
Anybody else on the panel want to jump in?
Yeah, I will, Lisa. I think that's great, Jason. I think a lot of what we see is, like you said, strategy for a study changing, right? Like it wasn't set up with the idea that it would be mapped to a CDIS compliant format. So nobody was looking at kind of the data set up from the start. So, I mean, over my career, I've seen that dramatically increase, where now, data collection has the end in mind, right? And there is a linkage there. We're seeing that, SDTM resources are included when data collection systems are set up, so that you make sure that there's a connection there and you can avoid remapping or excessive mapping to data. So there's been an increased awareness in standards and where you want to go in the end for a submission standard, but it's really when the strategy is not set up from the start that it's going to follow that pathway that we see the most challenges. So yeah, that's a really great question. And I think it is strategy for the study changing, as well as just kind of, lack of awareness of maybe how things are going to have to be mapped in the future for a submission standard requirement.
Mm-hmm. Any other commentary? I think I would add to this, and I'm actually curious, Deb and Jason's and Mark's feedback on this and thoughts on this, but I think we all know that, product development is risky, and most products actually fail very early in development. So even organizations that are quite savvy on these topics tend to make a judgment call on, do we invest the time and money putting all these things into place to set up the standards early, right? But then they need to make a decision, at what point do you set up the standards before it's too late and you find yourself in this situation. So I think in my experience, I've seen either organizations don't know what they need to do because they've never been to the US and worked with the FDA before, or very experienced organizations say, yeah, not yet. I need to save my money for my actual clinical trials, or, the work that I need to do to get to clinical trials. I'll do that organizational work, that strategic planning later.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
I
and I
think,
would add it. Oh, I was just going to add a complication on top of that is, in that latter scenario of, I'll do that later. I think, again, then we get back to the strategy change question, because a lot of times the people that make that decision aren't around when when the decision needs to be made of we need. And so sometimes they're not even aware that that decision was made early on, because those studies are done when they joined the company and took over the responsibility. And then it comes time to use the study, and they find out, and they're like, oh wait, we've got to take care of this now.
Mm-hmm. Not to mention, some organizations, their goal is to get to proof of concept and then divest. Mm-hmm. So it may be entirely a different company or team who is dealing with the situation at hand. Deb, you were going to say something.
Yes, I think, and I'm speaking for all the standards proponents that are out there. So I think we have to stop thinking about the standard as being the goal, right? And the target at the end, but instead, from the start, if you have a choice of how to set something up, why not use the standard, right? From the start. That's what it's meant for. That's really the purpose, is just trying to use it prospectively if you are planning things out. Now, Jason's point about academic studies or things that are, or, the real world data that's designed for a different purpose, right? You may not be able to use the standards, but fundamentally, when you can, and you're just choosing, use the standards, I think is the recommendation, as opposed to something else.
Yeah, I maybe just add one more thing to that. Oh,
sorry, I was going to say, I support that, Deb. I know, something we said in webinar 1 in relation to when to make that decision to switch to standards. And yes, that might be a judgment call that's made up front. But, per one of the examples in one of my case studies, it's the data collection is the important thing. If we're not collecting in a format that is going to be future proof, then we're introducing problems later on, and maybe further snowballing that time and cost. Which, again, if we can plan for that nice and early, great. That might not be a case of then initially having SDTM and ADAM in full setup as part of the plan, but maybe engaging with teams who can provide that advice, so that we're doing what we can to prepare without having to go sort of full bore from day one.
Yeah, and I was just going to add it, sort of maybe a bit of good news, on top of that, to a point that you made earlier, Deb, about kind of the way the industry is moving. Because I would say, even as short a time as 10 years ago, we were seeing CRO proposals for studies that didn't include standardized data sets as part of the study output, and that was an extra charge, right? And now I think it's much more common. It's probably uncommon to do it that way now. And the initial proposals from CROs that I see are including the standardized data sets as an assumption. And it really takes a conscious decision to say no, we don't want that now. And I think that that's a good move in the right direction.
Clearly, this is a very hot topic, so thank you for your question. We have lots of other questions and a few minutes more. Let's go with this one. What happens if FDA asks you to make changes to your analysis during the conduct of the study?
Well, I'll jump in with the regulatory perspective, and then so I would say that this is not all that uncommon. So the first is, don't pick box one and panic. A lot of times especially if you've not had a lot of interactions with the agency prior to coming to them sort of late in the game to talk about how you plan to analyze a study, they're going to take a different look maybe than you have already, and suggest a different way of analyzing the data, and it can be dealt with. And so, we see this a lot of times in that case, and sometimes we see it in more complex indications or areas where the treatment is really novel, and maybe we're in a disease area where there hasn't been a lot of, maybe there's not another approved product already, and so the agency is thinking through things at the same time that the company is thinking through things in terms of how the data will be analyzed, and they're trying to come up with the way that they think that will be best presented to them. So my advice would be, don't panic, and then you need to talk to your statisticians about what it will be the impact of that different analysis. Understand if it's acceptable or not acceptable. And if it's not acceptable, work with your statisticians, your biometrics partners to come up with a reasonable justification and rationale to go back and have further discussions.
And then if you have to make changes, right, the key is to do a very thorough assessment of the impact. So Jason mentioned the impact, but it could be impact on the actual data collection. It could be impact on, the programming, the mapping of the data, the outputs. So a very thorough assessment is critical to make sure that you understand the overall impact of the changes and that you can plan accordingly.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more. My studies have already started, but I see I've selected data points that cannot be mapped perfectly to CDISC standards. What do I do?
I can take this one, Lisa. I mean, first off, it's good that they've been identified. So, let's start on a positive with that one. And the earlier in that process, the better. So, assuming the study is too far progressed to be able to redesign the CRF page, then my best suggestion would be to make everything really clear and open with regard to decisions that we've had to make. If we've not able to map that data to CDISC, make it abundantly clear in documents like the data reviewer's guide as to how this data has been mapped and why it can't directly be mapped to a particular CDISC standard. And the second part is then learning from that. If you've got a package of studies and that's happened in one study, immediately look at the rest of your program. Are you in a position to improve those studies that are still under development and still being worked on, so that the rest of the package can then be fully aligned, and remain compliant. So, learning from that information, to improve down the line.
Mark, anybody have any additional commentary? All right, with that, I apologize. We haven't gotten to all the questions. If we didn't get to your question and you'd like us to answer it, please just reach out to any of us. We're happy to provide you with an answer. Hopefully everyone learned a lot from our two-part series. Later in the year, we do plan on hosting another webinar. The topic of this one is using non-traditional data sources to support regulatory development and approval. That date hasn't been set yet, so stay tuned. Thanks everyone again for your time and attention. Have a great rest of your day.